Hello? Hello? I can't see you, see myself on the big screen, but I can see messages coming from you. So I guess we're up and running. Um, First of all, could I just say thank you to At Home with Four Indies for hosting. It's Lingham's, Booker, Bookish, and Forum, um, and I'm very grateful that they wanted to have me on here. Um, Most people want to know is about my road to getting published. Well, it was a long and rocky road, I'm afraid. It didn't happen overnight. Um, After I'd written Georgia, my first book, which was the first one that was published, it took 7 years to actually get it accepted. But I was writing for quite a long time before that. I started writing when I was about 32, I think, when I was expecting my youngest child. And I started off with short stories. I did a writing course with the London School of Journalism by post, and I got a couple of short stories published at that time. And I thought it was going to be plain sailing from then on, but it wasn't. So then I wrote three books in all, which the first one was basically my life story. It was pretty dire, really. It was a huge, great tome, enormous, in fact, but it was turned down. But fortunately, the people who did turn that down sent me a nice letter saying you can write, but you've got enough material in this book for three books. So that kept me going. And then I started writing Georgia after having been told that I should write about what I knew, not just complete fantasy. So I started writing it, and in fact, I'd gone up to London to see an agent who kind of liked me, but thought the book I'd written at that time was rubbish. And I was on the train and I started thinking about my life. And I'd been married to a musician during the 60s, and I knew a lot about the pop world. So by the time I got to Bristol from London, I'd got the whole book in my head of Georgia. And it's about a mixed race girl who makes good and becomes a famous singer. Lots of wild coincidences and everything, but people really like it. My sister's my biggest fan. She reads it again every year. You know, a sad woman. I can't think why she doesn't get another book, but that's the one she likes. But from then on, I started to get, was quite keen on historical sort of stuff. And my early books were mostly about sort of girls and the trials and tribulations of rags to riches, really. They were mostly girls' names. Later on, I got into um, my first big historical book was Never Look Back, about the wagon trains going across America, which I always felt was my finest hour, really. It came out at the wrong time, really, in my career. If it came out now, it might have been a different story, but it's still one of my fans' favourite books. So I'm quite proud of that. Um, well, lots of you have said hello. Is Emma out there, and Tracy, and Donna, and Fiona? Hello to you all. I'm glad I've got an audience. It's a shame I can't see your faces too. So eventually, Georgia landed on the desk of a young editor who'd just gone to Heinemann then, and she hadn't actually bought a book before, and she read Georgia and loved it, and it was a big, mangy-looking manuscript by then that had done the rounds. She loved it and she bought it, and she's still my editor now with Penguin. I mean, she's very high up in Penguin now, and she doesn't do the day-to-day running stuff with me, but she's still with me after all these years. And I still think she's 25, but of course she's not. She's in her 50s, same as I'm in my 70s now. And I thought I was fairly young at the time, but I was 48 when I first got published. Um, yeah, so they tell me that now every 4 minutes one of my books is sold, which is pretty phenomenal. I actually often wake up in the morning and think, I must have made that up. I don't think it's really true, but people tell me it is. Um, One of the questions I've been asked is, did I enjoy school? And if any of the teachers picked up on my creativity. Unfortunately, I was famous for being a storyteller, And when I was a child, it was called Lying. It's funny that, I've now got a book called Liar. I used to make up stuff for everybody's entertainment all the time. And mostly people knew it was fictitious, but I did go a bit far sometimes. I remember once telling the kids at school that I'd run away from home because of my evil stepmother, and I was living under a hedge in a field. And no one ever questioned why I had clean white socks on and ironed hair ribbons on my hair. But that's what I used to say. And in fact, one of my friends, that's still a friend now, quite often reminds me of that. And she said, "Oh, I was so disappointed when I found out it wasn't true." And it got to the stage where the kids were bringing me in cake and sandwiches in the mornings because they thought I hadn't had any food. That was one of my finest hours. Um, but no, nobody really picked up on it. Apparently, there was my headmistress did say to my stepmother, Lesley could be a journalist. She's very good at English. And my stepmother said, but she can't spell. And that was it. So that went down the pan. And I wanted to be a nurse. And it was suggested that I wasn't responsible enough to be a nurse. So I became a nursery nurse instead, possibly because no one needs to be responsible when you're looking after children, or that's what they seem to think. So no, there was no writing early on, and I was too busy doing the research for what would happen in books later on, actually. No, I haven't got any long forgotten manuscripts hidden away. There's a couple of very embarrassing things I wrote in very early days, which I just keep for posterity, but I'm never attempting to get them published. They're too awful for words. Where do I get my ideas from? I don't really know. Um, they just sort of seem to come from me out of the blue. Uh, Long may it last like that. But the inspiration behind Liar was the fact that it's set in Shepherd's Bush in London in 1970, and that's where I was living in 1970. And my oldest daughter Lucy was born there. And at the time there was the rubbish strike, and just by our house there was this huge pile of rubbish. And I once joked to my then husband, be a good place to hide a body. By the time they move all that stuff, um, it'll just get taken off to the dump, and no one will ever know there's a body in there. And that sort of came back to me one day when somebody was talking about rubbish strikes, and I thought, well, that's a good start to a book. So for those of you who haven't read Lying yet, that's how it starts. This girl sees some boots sticking out, which she thinks are rather nice. She goes to pull one out and then finds there's a leg on the other end of it, which is a pretty horrible idea, but it made me laugh at the time. And she's a sort of young um, would-be journalist, but she's working for a local paper, and really all she does is sell advertising space. But because of her involvement in finding that first girl, her editor sends her to visit the girl's family. And she's incensed at the time by the awful things the press are saying about this girl who was a dancer in a club in London, in the West End of London. And she gets pretty bitter and twisted about that because she thinks it's so wrong that they wouldn't have said that if she'd been a ballerina or something, And she just takes more of an interest and builds up a sort of rapport with the parents. And then other girls start to get killed as well. And she has the idea that there is a connection between the three girls that are killed, and she starts to look for it. So that's Liar for you in a nutshell. I hope you enjoy it. Um, Research. People always are asking me about the research. When I'm doing historical stuff, that's a piece of cake to me because I love history, and I like nothing better than burying myself in some sort of period and finding out all about it. But now I've sort of started doing more crime. That's much more difficult to do because a lot of the stuff that you see on television isn't even accurate. So it's quite difficult. I have got a couple of tame policemen that I ask things from, but mostly I try and stick to a middle ground without, I don't really want to go into forensics because that's not my bag. The writers who do sort of forensics are so good at it. I see no point in me trying to copy them, and I don't think I ever will. And one of the reasons I'm not very keen on setting books in the present day is because of all the, the mobile phones, the emails, and everything, and of course DNA and all these things that have come along in the last few years that make it very, very difficult for someone to get away with anything as bad as murder, though people still seem to. But they've got to be very smart. I mean, if you watch all these sort of CSI programs, I suppose you could glean a lot of information from that, but I can't actually stand those American things. So I like things like Silent Witness. I find that fascinating. I don't know that I really want to go and watch bodies being cut open, though. That's going a bit far, isn't it? So why did I set the book in the 1970s? Well, pure laziness, really, because I was 25 then. I could remember everything that happened. I had a wonderful time during the 60s, and I can remember as 1970 came along, even though I was delighted to be having a baby, it was like the party was over that had been going on through the 60s. And a lot of nasty things happened in the early 70s with decimalisation, the 3-day week. People were losing their houses, having their houses repossessed and things because they couldn't keep up the mortgage. Life was pretty grim and comparable the way it is now, I think, really, where people were anxious about what was going to happen. And of course, during the 60s, we'd all thought we'd got it all sussed and it was all going to be wonderful from then on in, but it didn't really turn out like that. So that's the reason I did it in the 70s. Pure laziness, really, because I could remember everything. I only had to check a couple of little facts here and there, because I was married to a musician then still, and I had met lots of famous people when he was playing, everything from David Bowie to Steve Winwood and Steve Marriott and people like that. So all that was fascinating. But John's sort of career came to a sort of grinding halt, really, in the music world. The late in sort of 71, everything seemed to go pear-shaped for him. So it wasn't the happiest experience. I had a little shop for a while. Yes, life was a bit of a struggle then. But Amelia isn't based on anyone I know, the character in Liar. She's just an amalgamation of things I admire about people that are determined and, perhaps have had a bad start. There is a common theme, I think, in my books about people who've had early problems and, or screwed up childhoods. Somebody once told me that to become a writer, you have to have A, Irish blood, B, a Roman Catholic education, and C, a screwed up childhood. And that's me. So whether this is true or not, I don't know. But actually, if you delve into most writers, you find at least one of those three. So for anybody out there that wants to be, if you've got any of those, that's a good start if you want to be a writer. Do I write myself into anything? I did with one of my early books, Camellia, which also happens to be one of the rudest books I wrote. Back then, sexy books were considered to be a good idea. I found it a bit embarrassing now, probably because I'm not getting up to anything anymore. But and I sort of stopped writing sex because I found it a bit embarrassing now. Actually, one of my children said she liked Liar, but particularly because there wasn't any in it, and I think I'd embarrassed her. So no, I don't really write myself into things. In fact, I don't write anybody into books unless I can help it, unless there is a real reason for it. Like I've had a couple of people who've bid in an auction for a charity thing to be a character. So then I write them as not as themselves. I use their character and a bit about them, but put them into a fictional part. No, because I find when you're writing about real people, it's like they're looking over your shoulder all the time, and you can't make them do things that in real life they wouldn't do. So that's a no-no for me, really. It's not to say I won't ever, but I might write a memoir before long about my own life, but that's a different ball game altogether. Um, what makes a page turner? That's something people always want to know. Well, I heard a couple of writers discussing it once, and one said that every 8 pages you have to have a sort of bit of a mini cliffhanger before you go on to the next chapter. I think that's quite a good idea. So you keep people's interest, as they get to the end of one chapter, they can't wait to go on to the other one to see how that comes out. But in my opinion, the main thing you need is just persistence. You have to believe in yourself. You have to start writing and just stick at it and stick at it like I did when I think of all the hours I spent at it. Because nowadays people say to me, "Oh, you're so lucky," and I think luck never came into it. It was sheer persistence. That eventually, if you believe in yourself, I think we can all do anything we really want to do if we really try. And most people write something and then they just abandon it and put it in a drawer. So that's my advice to budding authors. Now, if anybody's got a question, do come up with it. I'll look on that line and see what you've got to say. Anyone's got any questions? There's lots of hellos, but that's it. No messages? Well, perhaps I should tell you about some of the more amusing things on research things. Um, when I was doing Never Look Back, I actually went with my daughter, first of all, we went to New York and we spent 2 weeks there looking at finding bits of New York that were really old to kind of set the tone of what we were going to do. And then we came home from that and sort of wrote that bit. And I wrote most of that book from imagination because my age group, we were brought up with wagon train books, and films, and we had Wagon Train on the television on Monday nights that everybody used to watch. And so I wrote it from imagination, and strangely enough, once I did go out into the Midwest, it is very much like I imagined. I was quite surprised to find out how similar it was. So I didn't have to do much about the scenery or anything like that because it was like I imagined. But what it was different was that when I found out about Red Indians and things, I mean, we all, for a start, imagine that all the wagons go round in a circle at night time, the sort of stuff you see on television, and that they all went one behind the other. Well, they didn't go one behind the other. They went side by side because the dust that they kicked up would have been absolutely appalling. So they no, I've just had a message to say they don't think I'm seeing the posts on the thing, and I'm not. And unless I can move them up or something, I can't see them. No, it doesn't seem as if there's. Ah, I see. Ah, right. I found some more. But there's not questions, there's lots of messages. Let's see what else there is. Right, well, I'll just have to carry on because I can't see them. That's a shame because I would love to have heard from you. Oh, I've suddenly become really big on the screen, having looked at myself in a little corner. Well, that's jolly. So, yes, well, let's see if I. Oh, when will Liar come out in the US? Well, at the moment, the Americans aren't buying my books because they say they're too English, but I'm hoping that's going to change. Um, And as I was saying, the whole thing about me doing the American book, which was called Never Look Back, was because I kind of wanted to get published in the US, and I thought if I write an American history book, people will be keen. I have heard from Americans that they think it's one of the best um, fictional history books that they've ever read. But yes, for instance, we're always led to believe that the Red Indians were killing people willy-nilly, but in fact, there was only about 120 people died through Indian attacks, and that was right at the end of the wagon train era. They'd The people that died of ordinary things like shooting themselves in the foot, having a wheel run over their leg, measles and things like that. So it wasn't, that sort of thing wasn't true. There was an awful lot of stuff. So that was really interesting, finding out the truth story. Anyway, I'm going to go through your things and see what else is going to. People are asking. Someone asking, um, when did I decide to shift genres in your writing, and how did you go about doing it? Well, I can't say I ever really did have a genre. Um, Not really. I mean, in the beginning, one of the reasons that they found it difficult to place me was because I didn't have one. So there was always an element of mystery in my books and that kind of thing, and some crime and various things. So it's just sort of moved on a notch. I am liking writing darker stuff, I must say. But getting older, I think I'm just becoming darker. There's someone saying they'd love to read my memoir. Thank you, Stephanie. I will endeavour to write it before I snuff it. Um, I don't know when the lie will come out in the US, but I hope it's not long. Now, somebody's there saying, unfortunately, I started to write a novel. I got up to chapter 3, then abandoned it, but I must stick with it now. I feel more determined. Well, Suzanne, you stick with it. You've got the right name, Valentinius. That's a great name, if that's how you pronounce it. Oh dear. It's Something's come up on my screen saying, sorry, we're having trouble with playing this video. I don't know what to do about that. I'll carry on talking to you and maybe it'll come back again, says she, hopefully. Now, what other questions? Um, do I think the character in Liar will be part of a broader series? I don't think so, really. I think that I hadn't planned to do that. Um, And can we have a spoiler about what your next book may be about? Well, the next one I'm doing as about a street and all the different characters that live in the street. And a child has been murdered in the field, and the police consider it might be one of them. So they're all quite dodgy characters in this street, and I'm enjoying myself thinking of all the appalling things they can be. It's one of those sort of linked detached houses that's all very neat and Stepford Wives, but I'm always suspicious of those sort of Stepford Wife places that behind that niceness there's something dodgy going on. So I haven't even decided yet who's going to kill the child at all. So, watch your space. Now, the video is good there, apparently. You're all seeing me. So it's just me, I can't see my face. Well, perhaps the screen has decided I'm so old and ugly that they don't want me to see my face. So let me see what other questions we've got here. Um, um, hang on, hang on there. Um, I've answered most of these. Um, would Do I think I'd use this pandemic as inspiration for a story? Well, strangely enough, my last book, which was You'll Never See Me Again, I touched on the Spanish flu, as I have in another book as well. And not only was that title of that book a bit prophetic, but the fact I'd written about the Spanish flu, I don't think I could be bothered to write anything about this one because for most of us, it was just been, I only speak for myself, of course, just one long tedious thing, and it still is. Watching every day on the news how many people had died and how many more people were taken into hospital, and this panic about, I mean, quite a few of my friends are still very panicked about it. I'm not. I sort of think, well, if you get it, you get it, and that's it. But that's me. I'm not suggesting everybody should be like that. But basically, my life hasn't changed much because I was at home writing and I've been sitting at home writing for 25 years. So, apart from the fact there was no nice dress shops to go into and I couldn't go out to dinner with anybody or lunch, it's okay. So it hasn't been that awful for me. And I must admit, I've had a few friends round in the garden, and I stand at the garden at the time of the when the lockdown was quite serious. I would sort of be out in my front garden and talk to people over the fence. So I wasn't desperately lonely. I miss my children and grandchildren. I've got my grandchildren here at the moment, and I'm looking after them because my daughter's gone back to work and needed a bit of help. But that was the worst of it for me. I didn't find it that bad. Um, and so I can't imagine why I would think it would be a good thing to write. I mean, I was in Thailand when the tsunami went on there, and my two of my daughters were missing, having gone down to where the tsunami happened. And for 48 hours, I thought they were gone, and at the bottom of the sea. Fortunately, they weren't. But I'd be more likely to write something about that because that feeling that you may have to come home without two of your children is just so ghastly that that's a good thing to write about. But just bland boredom. I mean, how do you write about boredom? You'd be boring, boring the people who are reading it, wouldn't you? So no, I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe refer it to, or maybe when this is all over, we'll start hearing ghastly stories that people have been dead for weeks and they've only just found them in their houses or something like that. Maybe that will make interesting reading, but I can't see it happening for me anyway. Um, Marion wants to know about how would I describe my writing day. Well, there was a time where as soon as I'd taken the dog out in the morning, I sat down at the desk and there I stayed. Unfortunately, I'm not that motivated anymore. And when the sun's shining, I like to be out and about, and particularly gardening. So then I write in the evenings. I mean, one of the good things about this pandemic is that the television's got so atrocious. It's not really that tempting to watch the television. So I have been writing recently because there's just nothing to watch. I mean, there's a few things on Netflix, but I've watched all the good ones. So yes, but I ought to be more motivated than I am. And Daniel wants to know, when I start writing, do I go with an outline or just start writing with an idea and see where it takes me? Yes, that's what I do, the latter one. I just start writing, and it's not a very sensible way to do a book because you waste a lot of time when you go off on a tangent and then you realize, well, that doesn't really work, I'll have to go back to the beginning. But it I've never been able to be a planner about anything. I very rarely plan anything in my life. Perhaps I'd have been more successful earlier if I had. Um, so I usually think about the character a lot before I start writing. The main character. I think I have to feel as if I know them and I've got them sitting there with me, and then that seems to take off from there. Um, for instance, in Never Look Back, the main character Mattie in there, I wanted her to open a brothel when she got to San Francisco, but all the way across America in the wagon trains, I realised she just hadn't got it in her to do that as much as I wanted to write it. So I had her working saving fallen women when she got to San Francisco rather than that. But when I did the Bell book, I was determined that this time I was going to write about somebody in a brothel because I think brothels are quite exciting places. Now, that's something that's interesting to write about, far more interesting than the pandemic. So that's how it goes for me. Getting to know the character and seeing how I feel about them. Um, do I ever use friends as ideas for characters? That's a question from Shelley. Um, Little bits of friends, I think I use. I certainly use the closeness of friendship. My friends mean everything to me, and I've had some of them I've had since I was at school, which isn't bad for an old lady now. And I would do anything for them. Some of these people I don't see every 5 minutes. I might not see them for gaps of a couple of years, and that sort of strength of a friendship I write about that quite a lot because it's important to me. Mary wants to know, do I have any favourite authors? Um, I'm actually one of these people that leaps from person to person. Apart from when I was younger, when I read things like Dickens and Daphne du Maurier, and I read everything they'd written. As I've got older, I just pick up books, and I don't go with all their books. William Boyd, I keep going back and finding new books of his. He's a wonderful writer. I absolutely loved The Beekeeper of Aleppo. That was a really good book. And Where the Crawdads Sing. Both of those two books I've read um, this summer and loved. I'm actually listening to a lot of things on Audible now because I can go out with the dog and have my phone in the pocket and just listen to it, and it's bliss. It's no good listening to it in bed, I find, because I just go to sleep. But if you're doing some chores around the house, it's quite nice to have it going on. So I read the Kindle at night time, and because it's lit and everything. But I really like proper books, and I don't think there's any compensation for a good book. And in fact, those books that I've listened to on Audible, I'm going to get them in book form to just put on my shelves because I don't know if you can see behind me, but I have an enormous amount of books, and I have a cull every now and again getting rid of the ones I wasn't mad about. But I've got books from when I was 14, 15. I've got some very, very early Penguins, where I was one there, ninepence. It's got on it. It seems ridiculous to think books were that cheap. Yeah, so for me, it's having the book and keeping it and loving it and dipping into it again and again. Um, I did a program a little while ago about my 6 favourite books, and one of the books that I talked about was Cold Comfort Farm. Now, I read that book by Stella Gibbons. I don't know how many of you have read it. I read it first when I was about 13 or 14. My stepmother gave it to me. It's a real poking fun, really, at those sort of country life books, but it was written in the 30s, and it was a classic. It's a classic that's just gone on and on and on. It's never really out of print, and it's extremely funny. This girl Flora Post doesn't really want to work when her parents have died, and they haven't left her enough money to live the life of Riley. So she decides to look up relatives to see who will look after her, and she ends up hearing from Ada Doom at Cold Comfort Farm, Howling in Sussex. I mean, just that name is hilarious. And off she goes to sort them all out. And this family are all very dysfunctional. There's one girl, Elphine, who stands in the fields spouting poetry, and then there's Seth, that every time the woodbine is in bloom in the village, another child of his is born to some unfortunate woman, and so on. It's that kind of a book. It's very, very funny, and even the church is hysterical. It's called the Church of the Quivering Brethren, and they stand and quiver. Well, that book, for instance, I lend that occasionally to people, and I hate lending books to people because people just don't give them back. But every time I lend that one, I say, you must give it back to me. It's really important. I want it. And some of the real favourites I've bought in really nice editions, so that where they've got a bit squashed or dog-eared. It's nice to have pristine ones. And of course, I always think I'm going to find time for reading them again. But I have read Cold Comfort Farm about half a dozen times in my life, and it never lets me down. I can sit and roar with laughter every time I read it. In Tracy, it says you can't beat a real book in your hands, and this is true. And and thank goodness we've got bookshops. To me, there's nothing better than going into a bookshop and just browsing in there and coming out with a bag full. I mean, the only thing that ever stops me from not buying half the books in the place is just the fact that, how long is this going to take you to read all this lot? Who's been the most fun character to write? Shelley asks me. I'm trying to think. I really like writing about Belle because she was a bit naughty. I mean, when she decided when she became and was sold into prostitution, she did what I would do if that happened. She decided to be the best of the best, and I like that idea. And I went with it when I was writing it. So that way you keep your self-respect because you think, well, I didn't want to do this, but now I'm here, I'll be good at it. And I think that's a really good attitude. I'm not suggesting any of you take up prostitution there. Oh, and Julie was saying that she has Belle to thank for winning a competition to have afternoon tea with you, and it was a brilliant afternoon. Yes, I remember that, Julie Twigs. It was lovely. It was your husband that made the clock for me, wasn't it? I think. And yes, it's still there. It's up on the shelf behind you. You probably can't see it from here. Tiffany, how long does it take from first putting pen to paper to the book being completed? Well, I have to do it in a year, really. Um, I usually spend the first 6 months of that poncing around, talking about doing it, and laying on the sofa, pretending I'm thinking about it, and then I get in a panic and I actually have to write it. So um, that's it. But at the moment, they really want the book I'm doing now by September, which is a bit of a tall order. I'm only about halfway through it at the moment. But I do find once I've got to a certain point in the book that it starts to write itself, because once I've got all the characters and I know where it's going, I get excited by it and I don't want to leave it there. And that's when the magic comes at the end. And then when I've finally finished, it's the hardest thing is to actually let it go, because I just want to read it again and polish it up and polish it up and polish it up. And fortunately now I'm I write well enough to not need an enormous amount of editing. Everybody needs a bit, you'd be rubbish if you didn't, but I don't need the masses that I used to do because I edit as I go along. Now, would I ever write? This is another message from Daniel, who's very busy. Would Would you ever write another author's character? Would you ever let another author write one of yours? I'd hate the idea of another author writing one of mine. I'm actually thinking of putting it in my will that when I'm dead and gone, I don't want anybody doing another one. There have been writers that have long since gone. That book, Flowers in the Attic, I can't remember the name of the writer, but they carried on writing books in her name for ages afterwards. I think that's awful. And I didn't really approve of them trying to write a sequel to Rebecca. I didn't read it because I didn't like the idea of it. No, I wouldn't want somebody else writing one of mine. So, but never say never. There might be a reason for it. Perhaps somebody give me loads of money to do it. Sharon's asking if I've always written, or did you only start in your 40s? And Sharon is actually 42, so she wants to know. No, I started in my 30s, but I only got published at 48. So all my 40s I was writing like crazy. So carry on, Sharon. You're the right age. Actually, when I first started writing, they always said that until you were 40, you hadn't got anything worth saying. And I think that's probably still true. I mean, there have been some startlingly good books by very young people, but really you do need a background of something. You should have done something and understand about people and all that kind of wisdom that comes with having been around the block a few times, I think. So no, I don't think 42 is a bad time to start. In fact, I would say it was perfect. So I'm just looking to see who else has said anything. My favourite authors, we've done that. I think somebody says, Stephanie says she'd like to read my memoir. It's going to be a bit racy. I did think that I might do it with world events, like put world events and what happened to me. I mean, I was a result of the D-Day landings, and my father was in the Royal Marines and he was wounded, and I was born more or less 9 months to the day, so obviously he wasn't badly wounded. And this made me kind of smirk about things, and I thought that's a good idea. I'll just stick with world events and write about what I was doing at the time when this was going on. So in the same way, I've written Liar because in the 70s, I was living there in Shepherd's Bush and noticing the rubbish piling up and stinking, and that started. Hello, Linda from North Wales. No questions from you. I'm just trying to see if anybody else has asked it. Yes. Someone from Rochester and in Minnesota. Hello, that's nice to hear from you. Yes. No, there's no new questions up there. Let's go back to the bottom and see if there's any more. Tracy's got to go. Thank you for bearing with me. And Jess, do buy my books. I need it. And I think it's probably time that I went actually. I'm getting very dry and coughing. Unless anybody's got any more questions they want to pop up right now, I think it'd probably be a good idea if I say goodbye and thank you for having me and for listening. And all of you that want to write, stick with it, and one day let me know that when you did. Oh, that's nice that people are saying. Stephanie's saying she's read all my books now, but Trust Me was my favourite. My feeling I got from it was really stuck with me. Did I go to Australia to research the orphanages? Yes, I did, Stephanie. I spent a month. Of all my books, I did more research for that book than anything. But the truth of the matter was that I was in an orphanage myself in England. In fact, the very one that I wrote about at the beginning of the book. And I remember them coming and asking us if we wanted to go to Australia and showing the film about the oranges and the sunshine and all the amazing wildlife and all that kind of thing. And so I went, but thanks, heavens that my brother and I weren't sent. We weren't even in the same orphanages. We were in two different ones because our mother had died. But I spent a lot of time with men who had been stuck into that awful school, Bindoon, which is still going strong now, and they've got Aboriginal children in there now. And I fear for those children really because it's the same setup as it was when I was writing about it. And I had a breakdown when I finished that book because some of the stories I was told just wouldn't go out of my head. And they're still there now. Lots of people have asked me to write more stuff about, perhaps continuing the story of people who survived that orphanages thing and the child migrant thing, but I can't. It's just too upsetting. But at the time when I wrote that book, people didn't actually believe that 15,000 children were sent from England over there to be abused. And I'm glad that people actually do take it seriously now. But it takes a while for these things to go through. And I am very proud of that book, but I cried buckets as I was reading it. And funny enough, my old headmistress was living in Australia and she picked it up, not realising that Lesley Pearse was in fact Lesley Sargent, the bane of her life when I was a child at first. And she was about halfway through it and she must have mentioned it, I think, on Facebook. And somebody said, that's the same girl that went to your school, was in your class. And she wrote to me and she said, I had a job to finish that book, she said. And she said, and I knew that it was somebody who came from the area around where the school was and that sort of thing. But she said, it never crossed my mind it was you. But anyway, she was so encouraging and she was so proud of me that I'd actually stuck at something. And she admitted that I was one of these children that she'd really worried about, that she thought I was going to, fall by the wayside. Well, I did a few times, but I came off the tracks once or twice, but got back on them. So yes, that was awful. Stephanie was saying she didn't know that I was in an orphanage, but yes, the thing is that it is true that the reason I have so many sort of sad things about people's early lives is because I know how that feels, and I think for all of us who have had tough beginnings, we quite like reading stories that are uplifting about people who have had that, but they get out of it one way or another. And I think it's important that we have something in front of us to look at and, you know, strive for. Well, I'm seeing lots of you are going to order books from Bookish and various other book places and Lingham's and Booker and forums. So bless you all for doing that. And I'm just flicking through these things to see if there's anything important that I've missed. Um, I think I've kind of done all of it now. So I think I'm going to say good night now. My grandchildren are stomping around over my head, and it's time they were in bed. So I'm going to go up and, you know, push them into bed. So good night, God bless, and let's hope this all this nastiness of the lockdown and the whole thing of the pandemic will be over soon, and we can all get back to normal, whatever normal is anymore. I don't think any of us know anymore, do we? It was lovely being with you, and now I'm going to press the button and go. And thank you. Bye bye.